Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week you have the zchus to read Parshas Tisa. We normally think of Tisa as the Egel, and obviously that's the central point and central part of the Parsha. But space-wise or psukim-wise, there's a number of psukim still devoted to the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan and the story around the Mishkan. So I want to do two Rambans relating to the Mishkan, and then the central Ramban relating to Egel and the Ramban's insight, and I really think it's a brilliant insight into the sin of the Egel. We obviously, it's one of those stories in the Torah where you're stuck in between, well, if you minimize the sin, so why was God so angry? And if you maximize the sin, how could Bnei Yisrael 40 days after having received the Torah at Har Sinai and received the Ten Commandments, how could they have created an avodah zarah? Okay, all that to come. Let's start at the beginning of the parsha. There's a long Ramban at the beginning of Tisa, which is obviously, the counting of Bnei Yisrael. Hashem Moshe lemor ki tisad rosh Bnei Yisrael ivkudehem v'natenu ish kofer nafsho la'Adonai bifkodotam v'lo yihi yevohem negef bifkodotam. Right? There's something scary about counting Bnei Yisrael. But if you do it through machatzit hashekel, then v'lo yebohem negef pifkodotam. So this reminds the Ramban, it's a small point, but I think it's a significant point. How is it that David HaMelech was nichshal in this aveira? If it's so clear that you're not allowed to count Bnei Yisrael directly, how could David HaMelech, who was tzaddik, it wasn't his Yetzer Hara that got him to do it, how could he have done it? So the Ramban says, not too long into this long Ramban, he says, "Umipnei shelo nitparesh kan imhi mitzvat dorot o lisha'ah." Since the Ramban says pshat in the pasuk, it's hard to figure out. It's hard to figure out whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling us never count Bnei Yisrael, or Moshe this time don't count Bnei Yisrael directly. So he says, since it's not clear, ta'ad David umana utam below shkalim v'haya hanegef bahem. That's how the sin came about. It wasn't that David HaMelech disregarded a mitzvah HaTorah. God forbid. It's that David HaMelech didn't understand pshat in the pasuk. The pasuk was telling us, "V'lo yemab negef l'dorot." Never ever count Bnei Yisrael directly. David HaMelech thought the pasuk meant, no, it's a mitzvah l'shaita. It's a mitzvah for Moshe Rabbeinu not to count Bnei Yisrael directly right now. But at some later point in history, it would be fine if you counted Bnei Yisrael directly. Okay, that's an insight into the Ramban. It's just interesting that sometimes the Ramban sees a pasuk in the Torah, and it bothers him that something in Nach is inconsistent. It bothers him that David HaMelech could have messed up something so obvious. And so he points out that the psukim at the beginning of this parsha are not so simple to understand. Okay, but there's something else going on here. And it's something that Rashi recognized first, and then the Ramban recognized, and they have completely different approaches to it. And that's the following. How many Jews left Mitzrayim? So the answer we know is it's a number in the Torah. It's a number more than once in the Torah. 603,550. Okay? So the Ramban Rashi's going to ask an interesting question. And here's the Ramban quoting Rashi. V'kasav Rashi, lefi sheramaz kan shalosh trumot. Right, the hint, Rashi's pshat in the pasuk is the Torah is commanding us three different trumot. Achad trumata adanim shemina'am kishit chilu b'nidvat hamishkan achai yom kippurim b'shana rishana. Right, the first one is trumata adanim. They had to give enough silver so that they could make the sockets into which they placed the wood panels of the Mishkan. Okay, that happened the day after Yom Kippur. Right, that's the narrative according to all Rishonim, because till they got finished with the Egel, nothing happened till after Yom Kippur. V'nasnu kol achad machzit hashekel v'alo lema'at hakikar. Everybody gave a machzit hashekel, and it added up to ma'at hakikar. Shenema v'chesed pekudei ha'ida ma'at kikar. V'ashniya afi al yidei minyan shemina'an mishu kam hamishkan hu minyan ha'amur b'chodesh ha'pekudim be'echad la'chodesh ha'sheni b'ashana ha'shenit. Vidnatnu kol achad machatzit hashekel liknot mehem karbonot zibur. Okay, so says the Ramban, there are basically two counts of Bnei Yisrael, And they happen at two different times. Says Rashi, Ve'im tomar, v'chi avsha shebishnehem hayu Yisrael shavin 600,000 u3,000 ו550. Could it really be that 7 months go by and nobody is born and nobody dies? V'lo bishtei shanim hayu. It was 2 different years. V'i avsha shelo hayu bishat minyan harishon b'nei 19 v'nasu b'nei 20. Right? If you're only counting from 20 years and up, says the Ramban, there had to be many, many Jews who were 19 at the time of the first count. And in the 7 months between the first count and the second count, and these dates are precise, because in Bamidbar, the Torah gives us the exact dates of the counts, how could no one have turned 20? Tshuva davar. Rashi says, here's the answer. Eitzel shnota anashim bishana achat nimnu. Aval leminyan yitziat mitzrayim hayu shtei shanim. Says the Ramban, no, it says Rashi, I'm sorry. It looks like 2 different years, but it's not. For birthdays, says Rashi, the year begins in Tishrei, and it ends the next Rosh Hashanah in Tishrei. So therefore, all of the people, nobody turned 20 between Rosh Hashanah of this year and Rosh Hashanah of next year, because it's all 1 year. It's like there's a fiscal year for birthdays. And anybody born, every single person for years turns the next year on Rosh Hashanah. Right? It's kind of not a lot of fun for birthdays because everybody has the same birthday, then it's Rosh Hashanah. But for purposes of answering the question, it's a lovely answer, right? Everybody turned 20 on the same day. Nobody turned 20 in between the 2 dates. Shelitziat Mitzrayim monim mi Nisan. It's true. We count, Bnei Yisrael counts years from Nisan. So it would look like 2 different years. Ulishnota anashim monim leminyan shnot olam hamatchilim b'tishrei. But for human birthdays, we count from Tishrei. Nimtzu shnei haminyanim b'shana achat. Therefore, it turns out both counts of Bnei Yisrael happened the same year. Haminyan ha'echad b'tishrei la'achar yom ha'kippurim shenitratza kadosh baruch hu liYisrael v'nitztavu al ha'mishkan. The first count happened the day after Yom Kippur, after God had forgiven us for the Chet HaEgel. That's when we started building the Mishkan. V'hasheni be'echad b'iyar. And the second count happened 7 months later in Iyar. Kol elu divrei harav. Okay, that's Rashi. It's fascinating why the Ramban doesn't like this. We'll come to it in a second. Vani Temas, says the Ramban, and I wonder, Ve'ech yitachen sheyeh kahal gadol kamahu v'lo yamutu bo bechatzi shana leme'otu alafim. Forgetting birthdays, he says, how could it be that there are 600,000 males and nobody dies? Hundreds must have died. Thousands must have died. That's the way of the world. V'nei lefi divrei harav amdu kishiva chadashim v'lo meit achad. Even if Rashi's right that nobody had a birthday, nobody died in 7 months? Could it really be that nobody died in 7 months? Don't we have a story in the Torah of people who were Tamei Meis and they came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, let us bring Pesach Sheni because we can't bring Pesach Rishon because we're Tamei Meis? It's an interesting proof for the Ramban. But the Ramban says, you see, people died in the Midbar. Now, it could be that Rashi really disagrees. It could be that Rashi thinks there was a miraculous, the life in the Midbar was miraculous for Klal Yisrael, and nobody died. That would explain why Vayhi Anashim Asher Hayu Tmeim L'Nefesh Adam, Rashi tells us all the Madrashim there. Either it was a Meis Mitzvah, or it was the people who took care of Aaron's sons who were killed at Chanukas HaMishkan, right? There's some specific story. Why does Rashi need to quote Madrashim there to tell us who died? Isn't it obvious? People die all the time. So it could be, I really believe that for Rashi thinks, no, people didn't die. It was a miraculous time. And during this time, whoever left Mitzrayim was going to go into Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the Ramban disagrees. And it wouldn't be for me to say who's right or wrong. Va'od kasheli. But the Ramban's really bothered by this. Ki minyan shnota anashim einenu liminyan shnot olam mitishrei. Nobody counts birthdays from Tishrei. Ramban is the big defender now of birthday parties. Ramban says it can't be that everybody celebrates their birthday on the same day. Aval hume eid le'ed miyom hivaldo. There was no period of time, says the Ramban, in which people celebrated all of their birthdays on Rosh Hashanah. Why? Birthdays work me'ed le'ed. They work full years. If you're born on the 17th of Adar, that's your birthday. What's the problem? Likach nemar bohem esrim shana v'mala. Shehiyu shanim shleimot lahem. When the Torah speaks about a person's age, it means full years from the date of his birth. V'chein b'chol minyanei haTorah bishnot ha'adam kachu minyan me'ed le'ed. That's how the Torah counts years. Kimo shamru mesechet arachim shana ha'amura bekadishim u'bebatei arei choma u'shnei shanim shebesadeh achuza v'sheish shebe'eved ivri v'shebeben v'shebebat kulam me'ed le'ed. Says the Ramban, I fundamentally disagree with Rashi that birthdays are counted with sort of 1 year for everybody. Anybody whose birthday is after Rosh Hashanah, they become a year older on Rosh Hashanah. Ramban says it's wrong. Birthdays work me'eit la'eit. All ages in the Torah work me'eit la'eit. I think the Ramban is saying, we've never seen this before. We've never seen at any point in the history of the Jewish people that birthdays were other than the day on which you were born. And so the Ramban fundamentally disagrees with Rashi's pshat. Maybe, I think he would say, maybe nobody died. I don't know. But I know for a fact that people had to turn 20. So then how does it work? So the Ramban suggests something different. He says, Aval yoter nachon shene'emar shekein ira ma'aseh shahayu Yisrael b'shat minyan harishon tov reish gimel elef et tov kuf nun u'meitu mehem harbe b'shiva chadashim. Ki minhag sheba'olam. Right? As is the normal course of the world, says the Ramban, people died in between the two counts. Ubnei esrim mashlimim shnatam mitishrei va'adiyar. However, let's assume that 25,000 Jews died in those 7 months. Says the Ramban, but wouldn't it be amazing if 25,000 Jews also turned 20 during that period of time? Right? So it works perfectly. People die, and they're replaced by people who turned 20 that year. And those numbers happen to coincide. V'ira hadavar shayu hamashlimim kiminyan hametim. And they actually worked out perfectly. Okay, so says the Ramban, Aval lefi da'ati ein hashvat haminyanim ha'ela she'ela klal. But I don't think it's a problem at all. Ki b'minyan harishon nimneh shevet levi imahem. Ki adayin lo nivchar v'lo yatsa michlal ha'am. In the first count, the 603,350 Jews included Shevet Levi. There's no reason to exclude them from that first count. Ubiminyan sheni ne'emar lo achet matei Levi lo tifkod ve'et rosham lo Tisa. It's only the second time that they excluded Shevet Levi. V'inei hamashlimim shnatam shena'asu bein shnei haminyanim b'nei esrim shana hayu karov la'esrim elef. Ramban thinks the number of Shevet Levi and the number of people who turned 20 that year was around 20,000. V'zed davar barur ki mimashu tzrach lomar b'minyan sheni achat matei Levi lo tifkod ve'et rosham lo Tisa re'aya shehaya nimna imahem adheina. Right? It's proof. Originally, Levi was counted. Now they're excluded. Va'ata nivchar hashevet ahu v'nimna la'atzmo lihiyot ligyon melech. Now Shevet Levi is being chosen as the special tribe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so therefore they're being excluded from the count. So the Ramban gives two possible answers, both of which are very, very plausible and very, very compelling. The first is that people died. It's true. But by chance, the number of people who turned 20 and entered the count equaled exactly the number of people who died. And so the numbers happened to work out exactly. The second pshat seems to be slightly more miraculous. He's agreeing with Rashi. Let's say nobody died. Nobody, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a miracle. Nobody died in those 7 months. However, Shevet Levi that were separated from all of Klal Yisrael, that only happened later. So in the first count, the 20,000 20,000, give or take, of Shevet Levi, they were included. In the second count, the 20,000 of Shevet Levi were excluded. However, the number of people who turned 20 happened to equal exactly the number of people who were in Shevet Levi and who have been excluded from the count. So in either way, right, the Ramban disagrees with Rashi about how the numbers equal out. Rashi thinks it's a result of nobody dying and the numbers staying exactly the same. The Ramban saying he doesn't see how that could be. Didn't people turn 20? Rashi says no, they didn't turn 20 because it was all within the same year. The Ramban thinks that's crazy. Everybody knows that a birthday is a birthday. And you don't turn a new age on Rosh Hashanah. You turn a new age on the day that you were born. However, one of two possibilities. Either the number of people who died equaled the number of people who turned 20 during the course of the year, or Shevet Levi was excluded from the second count, not from the first count. Nobody died, and the number of people who turned 20 equaled exactly the members of Shevet Levi. Okay, in there is also this idea of, who the people who died, who the Tmei Mace in the Midbar, is that a proof that people died regularly or not? For Rashi, it's not. It was a unique situation. For the Ramban, it is. Okay. We're only going to have time for one more Ramban. So let's go to Ched HaEgel. And Ched HaEgel obviously is, it's as bad as it could be. It's as bad as it could be because, one, it looks like Klal Yisrael worshipped Avodah Zarah, but it's much worse than that. Because they worshipped Avodah Zarah at the foot of Har Sinai 40 days after HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to them in the greatest Gilui Shechina in the history of the world. And it's hard for us. It's really hard for us, and we'll see, it's hard for the Ramban to accept the fact that Klal Yisrael were able or willing to worship Avodah Zarah so soon after Matan Torah. And so the Ramban has a different understanding, and he thinks that, our reading of the Psukim is too shallow, and it's not really what it says. So it's Perek Lamed Bet, and in Perek Lamed Bet, the Torah tells us as follows. Vayar ha'am ki voshesh Moshe laredet min hahar. The people saw that Moshe was delayed in coming down from the mountain. Vayikahel ha'am al Aharon. They gathered on Aharon. Vayomru elav kum aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu. Ki zeh Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu mi Mitzrayim lo yadanu mehayalo. And the Ramban's going to be medayik in those words. It says, Asher yelchu lefanenu. So first he quotes Rashi. Elohus harbe ivu lohem. They desired many, many gods. Ki zeh Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu me'eretz Mitzrayim vayam moreh lanu haderech na'aleh bo lo yadanu mehayalo. We don't know what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't know where to go. Va'ata tzrichim le'elokut harbe asher yelchu lefanenu lashon Rashi. Right? Now we need all kinds of, or any kind of God to tell us where to go. It says the Ramban, Ve'ein l'shano mechuvan. He doesn't reject it, but he says Rashi's not being precise. Aval hakatuv hazeh hu mafteach ladat inyan ha'egel umachshevet osav. He said, but this pasuk is the key to understanding what exactly happened with respect to the Egel and what was the intent of the people who pushed for an Egel. Ki biyadua shelo hayu Yisrael sfurim shemoshe hu ha'elokim v'shehu b'kocho asa lehem ha'utot v'hamoftim. He says, first of all, let's be fair to Klal Yisrael. It's inconceivable that they confused Moshe Rabbeinu for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It just can't be. They knew who Moshe was, and they knew who God was. They met him at Har Sinai. They were all Nevi'im. Right? The Ramban's understanding of Har Sinai was that the event itself was much more important than the substance. It wasn't that they got Aseres HaDibros. It's that they met HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were prophets. V'shehu b'kocho ki biyadu shelo hayu Yisrael sfrim shemoshe hu ha'elokim v'shehu b'kocho asa lehem ha'utot v'hamoftim. Nobody thought Moshe was God. U'ma tam sheyomru kevan shehalach Moshe mimenu na'aseh Elokim. Why in the world would any rational people say, okay, Moshe's missing. Let's make a new God. They knew who God was. And it wasn't Moshe. Va'od. Second point. Ki b'feirush amru Elokim asher yelchu lefanenu lo sheyihiyu notnim lahem chayim ba'olam hazeh o ba'olam haba. Says the Ramban, when they say Elohim, they don't mean a God. Because they're not making a God who's going to bring them to Olam Haba, who's going to give them eternal life, who's going to reward them. Aval hayu mevakshim Moshe acher. They wanted somebody else instead of Moshe. So the first thing is the Ramban is reducing the sin to replacing Moshe Rabbeinu, right? It's almost like Bnei Yisrael at Har Sinai. Okay, where are we going to travel now? I don't know. Who tells us where to travel? Moshe Rabbeinu. It's like Moshe Rabbeinu where Lehavdil, ways. We need some app that's going to tell us where to go. We're not trying to replace God. It's not Avodah Zarah, but we need somebody to tell us where to travel. Amru Moshe shahoreh lanu haderech mimitzrayim vadheina shayu hamasaim al pi Hashem biyad Moshe hine avad mimenu. Right? There's no one to tell us where to travel. Na'aseh lanu Moshe acher sheyoreh haderech lefanenu al pi Hashem biyado. Let's make a new Moshe Rabbeinu who's going to tell us where to travel. Do we go right or left? Which way is it to get to Eretz Yisrael? Ramban's not saying it's not a sin, but he's reducing it significantly from the sin that we think it is. He thinks it's not Avodah Zarah. V'zeh tam hizkira Moshe ish asher ha'elanu asher ha'elanu. Right, we're replacing Moshe Rabbeinu, whose greatness was he tells us where to go. Ki yitzrichu le'ish Elokim, we'll need another man of God. V'chein tuchal lahavin zeh mitshuvat Aaron el Moshe Rabbeinu. He says you can see this also from when Aaron answers Moshe. And these are really difficult psukim. Right? Aaron says to Moshe, what terrible sin did the people do to you that you brought this terrible crime upon them? Vaytat shuvato vayomru li kum aseh lanu Elohim. V'omar lahem lemi zahav hitparaku. And so I told them who has gold, and they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire. V'hinei Aharon mitnatzel Moshe v'omar lo al yichar af Adoni v'hu kimosif al chatato pesha. On the one hand, Aaron is answering Moshe saying, don't get angry at me. Please don't get angry at me. It's not my fault. But he's describing a terrible sin. They came to me, they said, let's replace Moshe. And I said, I'll do it. Sha'omar ki hein bikshu mimenu avodat gilulim va'asalhem biyadav v'lama lo yicharapo. If they were asking Aaron for avodah zarah, and Aaron made an Egel, made avodah zarah with his own hands, isn't that the worst sin ever? Says the Ramban, that's not what happened. Uma chata gidolamizo. What could be a worse sin than making avodah zarah? Aval ha'inyan kimo she'amarti. Shelo bikshu ha'egel lihiyot lahem la'el meimitu mechayeh. They weren't looking for a God. They knew who God was. V'kiblu avodat elokut alehem. And they accepted God's reign over them, and they worshipped God. Aval yirtzu sheyihiyeh lahem b'makom Moshe mored darkam. All they were looking for was to replace Moshe Rabbeinu with the new Moshe, with the new app, with the new ways. V'zeu heitzat luto shel Aaron. That's what Aaron was saying to Moshe. It wasn't avodah zarah. It was just a way to keep them happy. Ta'an ki lo amru lo rak she'aseh lahem Elohim asher elchu lifneihem bimkomcha Adoni. Shelo yad'u mehaya lecha. No one knew what happened to you. Vim tashuvim lo. Are you going to come back or not? V'lachein heim hayu tzrichim lemi sheyoreh lahem darkam. So they need to know where to go. And if you come back, says Aaron to Moshe, okay, they'll leave the Egel and they'll follow you. And the Ramban says, and this is significant, V'chein haya hadavar, and that's exactly what happened. Ki kevan shera'u ha'amet Moshe, the second Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the machaneh, Miyad hinichu at ha'egel ubo'atubo shehinichu lo l'sarfo. Immediately the people abandoned the Egel. They allowed Moshe to burn it. Ulzarot afro al pnei hamayim, and to spread its ashes over the water. V'lo hayamehem cholek alav klal. nobody fought with Moshe because it wasn't a real avodah zarah. It was simply a means to get to the next place. He didn't yell to people for avodah zarah. They were embarrassed. They ran away. There was no war in the sense that people didn't object to what Moshe was doing. They recognized immediately. If they had the Egel as a god, they wouldn't just let Moshe come in and destroy their new god. Right? Would anybody allow that to happen? If we invested in something, even just an object, as our god, we would defend the god. So says the Ramban, it was all a big misunderstanding. It's a sin. And we'll still have to figure out why it's such a big sin, and it is a big sin. But the Ramban says it's not what we're afraid of. It's not, God forbid, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai, Bnei Yisrael at Har Sinai, rejected God and chose, a golden calf, and it said, "Oh, this is the God that took you out of Egypt." It doesn't make any sense. It can't make any sense. I think the Ramban has too much of a love and too much of a respect for Klal Yisrael to entertain that as a possibility. He doesn't see it at all. So what did happen? So I think underneath the Ramban's language is a bigger point. And it has to do with the Ramban's view of the order of the Parshios. Remember, the Ramban thinks that Yesh Mukdam Mu'achar B'Torah, and that God gave Moshe the mitzvah of the Mishkan before the Chet HaEgel. So why would he have done that? So I'll try to explain it to you in my own words. I think this is Pshat in the Ramban. It's just sort of below the surface here and in a number of other Rambans. The Ramban would say as follows. When we were at Har Sinai and we literally we saw God's voice and we heard God's thunder and lightning, things that normally don't happen, we had an encounter with the divine, and it created within us a Yetzer Hara for some tangible representation of God. I really think so. The way I imagine it, and I'm sorry if I say it in a silly way, but, I've never used cocaine in my life. I'm not bragging. I never have, okay? But I think if I did, when I get up in the morning, I don't have to overcome a desire for the drug. I don't know what it tastes like. I never had it. I don't fight it. But if you're at Har Sinai, the encounter with God created within us a need and a desire for more. Something that the truth is you and I don't realize in our own lives. If we saw somebody worshiping a tree, we wouldn't be offended as much as we'd think it's just silly. Everybody knows God doesn't have a guf, no dimyon, right? These things don't exist with respect to God. We should know that. But for the Dor HaMidbar, they did exist. They encountered it. They had cocaine. And they had to fight it going forward. When they woke up in the morning, they wanted to physically experience God in a way that you and I never desired. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew that, and he saw that coming. And he created the Mishkan to try to serve as a place, again for the Ramban, a Makom Hashras Hashchina, where you go and you feel God's presence. And the Mishkan was going to be some kind of prophylactic in advance of this need, right? There's a downside to every upside. Experiencing God, one on 600,000, experiencing God, feeling God's presence, creates within us a desire to feel that again. That desire was going to be fulfilled by the Mishkan, but it happened too quickly. Even before we could feel that desire, Bnei Yisrael miscounted the days that Moshe would be gone and created the Egel, right? But the Egel was never supposed to take the place of God. The Egel was supposed to be some kind of tangible, physical entity that I could feel close to in place of the God that I had actually met, in place of the God that I had actually seen, in place of God's voice, whose voice I had actually heard at Har Sinai, right? It's hard for us to imagine how compelling such a desire is, because we've never had it before. The thing that we most desire in the world is the encounter with the infinite God. But it would create within us a risk. It would create within us the risk of avodah zarah because we would want it again. It's hard to have the greatest thing ever in the world happen to you once and not desire it again. We all say we just want to meet God once, we just want to see a miracle once, and we'll know there's a God and we'll never ask again. But it's not true. We would want it again and again. And we have to create a world, says the Ramban, in which we have to live with less. So the first idea was the Mishkan. And that didn't work well enough because Bnei Yisrael couldn't wait. But I think essentially that's what the Ramban is saying. He's saying, on the daf, he's saying that they weren't trying to replace God. It wasn't avodah zarah to begin with. They were just trying to replace Moshe because frankly, they needed to know where to travel. But I think beneath that is this idea that the encounter with God was made more necessary by Maimad Har Sinai. And Maimad Har Sinai, we saw God, we felt God, and we wanted to see and feel God again. And that might be pshat also. Okay, Yesh Koch to everybody. We only did 2 Ramans this week, but they were both good. And I'll see you all next week. Shabbat Shalom.